Hello and welcome everyone. This is day 41 of our ongoing series 75 Days of Partition. We are commemorating 75 years since partition happened. I'm Aprajita, a story scholar with the 1947 Partition Archive. I'm so happy to join you all today with the beautiful and amazing writer Aanchal Malhotra. She is best known for her work on oral history and material culture of the partition of India in 1947. To tell you about her education, she received a BFA in traditional printmaking and art history from Ontario College of Art and Design, Toronto, where she also won the University Medal and Sir Edmund Walker Award for Graduate Studies. She completed a MFA in Studio Art from Concordia University, Montreal. Now, she belongs to the family of the famous Bhari Sons booksellers, founded by her paternal grandfather Balraj Bhari in 1953 in New Delhi. She is also the co founder of the Museum of Material Memory, which is a digital repository of material culture of the Indian subcontinent, tracing family history and social ethnography through heirlooms, collectibles, and objects of antiquity. Aanchal Malhotra's debut book, Remnants of a Separation, A History of the Partition Through Material Memory, was published by HarperCollins India in 2017 to mark the 70th anniversary of Indian independence. It is an attempt to revisit the partition through personal and intimate objects that refugees carried with them across the border during their migration. Her recently published book, In the Language of Remembering, reveals how partition is not yet an event of the past and its legacy is threaded into the daily lives of subsequent generations. Bringing together conversations recorded over many years with generations of Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and their respective diaspora, it looks at how partition memory is preserved and bequeathed, its consequences disseminated and manifested within family, community, and nation. And I had the pleasure of meeting this author at Barison's outlet in Chandigarh, where she personally signed the copy of Remnants for me. And I had a fangirl moment. Welcome, Achal. I'm absolutely delighted to have you here today. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and I also am excited to speak.
Let me jump straight to my questions since these are short bursts of the podcast. The oral history emerged as a potent way to deal with partition history. We had Urvashi Batalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, bringing out the experiences of women during partition in the 1980s, 90s. Then yesterday we had Professor Andrew Whitehead, who, as a BBC correspondent, he recorded over 200 interviews in the subcontinent. We have Professor Ishtiaq Emil, and there were other scholars as well. What do you think? What brought about this change in the way of looking at this history, and how far do you think it is a reliable source? Because this depends on memories and which are often considered as very vague, elusive, and inadequate as far as history is concerned.
A lot of people ask this question on the veracity of memory and how reliable oral history testimonies can be, and how do we know that our subject is accurate, particularly recollecting a time that has passed so long ago. But actually, I have never considered first-hand partition testimony as vague. In fact, the survivor, when you're speaking to them, they are often exceptionally detailed in the things that they recall from that time, even small things like what they may have been wearing when they left, or what they left behind in their home that they wish they could have carried. These conversations are very nuanced and multidimensional, and as a person is thinking back to their older self, layers are being revealed of the things they remember and the things they may have forgotten and are rediscovering at the time. But I think in the case of partition in South Asia, these oral testimonies have become essential in understanding the human history of partition, because for far too long the event has been described in terms of numbers and statistics of migration, which mostly render the survivor's individual experience as absent. The unique story of the survivor, or their fears, or their losses, their circumstances, they hardly find any space in official or archival history unless they are associated to, say, larger political instances or a larger riot or something like that. But human beings are not one-dimensional creatures, and so I find it very dangerous sometimes to homogenize the narrative of partition as one single story, since it impacted such a vast population within any cross-section. You see, there will be a multitude of narratives. So I think that there are many merits of oral history. Yes, of course, it does come with its own shortcomings, where this question of being reliable or not will perhaps always be asked. But oral history allows us to include the stories of each affected group of people within a historical event in their own words. It allows for the stories of communities that have been marginalized or rendered invisible by official archive to be heard. It allows us to return to that time to create an ethnographic landscape of what happened, of how people lived in their own words. Oral history sometimes also challenges the state propagated history of the time, or even of the politics of today. And I think rather than homogenizing the partition experience, it actually, as something that's general nostalgia or collective memory or general loss, it offers us very, very specific instances to enter into the landscape of partition. Um, it, I think, in my experience, has also opposed the idea of what partition has been made to look like from films or media, because it is portrayed as an event wholly of violence, and naturally, as something that is such a magnanimous event, there are more facets to it than just violence. And I think um, I guess, render partition only as a violent event is to do injustice to the great emotional landscape of that time, where there have to be more actions, more emotions than just hate and violence. And I think this becomes very clear when you listen to the stories of people.
That's very true, actually. The other day, I was having a conversation with Professor Farooq Khan, and he told me that how there's no, not even a single story belonging to each person. There are multiple dimensions to it, and it
Correct.
it
Right.
changes, it alters every time it is told.
Right. And
So
it
also,
may contradict
working.
one another. A person in their
Yes.
own story may contradict one another. I mean, as you've been in the field, you know that it is possible to feel hate but also loss. It is possible to feel loss but also hope at this, just momentarily after one another. So I feel like this is really the multifaceted storytelling that has evolved with the tradition of oral history gaining resonance.
Yes. So, like you mentioned, that I've been in the field and I've been working with the archive, and that this has really increased the depth with which I understand the pain of these people, of these partition witnesses. And only when I've talked to them, listened to their stories, that this event starts taking a human dimension, and it
Right.
becomes more than just a historical drawing of a line or the statistical data that we are fed. And in my opinion, these textbooks, historical records, they're not enough, and they cannot just make you understand what when somebody reads a book like yours, or maybe listen to the witnesses firsthand. And going down the line, such kind of oral histories would hold a very special significance, and the kind
Right.
of possibilities for research that will be created would be limitless. Uh,
Mhm.
Now, you also brought the question of material memories to the fore, which is very, very interesting. When it was difficult to talk about their experiences, it was easier to talk about their possessions that they carried along. The same concept has also been like displayed at the museum by looking at the objects carried at a time of absolute chaos, and thinking that what would somebody take when you would be knowing that probably you're never going to return. And I think it is an effective way of generating memories. How would you briefly describe what have you found in terms of your research on what people could carry across the border?
I think at the beginning, when I started doing interviews, to ask the question directly felt quite intrusive for me. And also, I didn't know how to ask the questions because I don't come from a background of history, I come from a background of art. And so I would ask the people about what they carry, the object that they had taken from their home. And the object then became a catalyst to sometimes speak about something that was still quite sensitive, it became a portal into the past in a way. They would graze a thing or caress a piece of fabric or remember a time where a certain object had been used before partition. And it was a very visceral way into literally being transported back into the past, but also I think back across a very militarized border. I think that was one of the beautiful things about using an object catalyst, that somehow travel through stories became very possible. And the kind of landscape that people used to live in before partition kind of started taking place in the rooms that we were speaking. People would remember their friends, they would remember their house, they would remember that, yes, this is the ring that I carried that my mother gave me, and this is why I carried it, and I wish I had carried other things. And then we would reach the topic of partition and we would broach something more sensitive. But I think it was also a gentler way to enter into that conversation. The kinds of objects, you put it very well. Like when you are leaving your home and you really don't know whether you will return, what do you take? And people took all kinds of things. And I think what someone took also told us about what they knew about partition. It was if someone took a lot, like they were able to pack their whole house and take it. They probably knew partition was imminent. They probably knew they had to leave. They also probably knew areas that were safer. So they took many things. If people thought partition was happening but assumed it would be a temporary event, maybe they took only precious things. Maybe they took only things for the summer, like the clothes you're wearing, or they thought they would come back, so they didn't take everything. These people also locked their homes. Many people also locked their homes. In fact, they took the keys because they were so certain that they would return. I think that anytime I come across keys in my research, it's one of the most heartbreaking things, because that person or that family had so much hope and so much conviction that, yes, of course, the riots will die down and we will come home. And then there were stories related to objects that had been carried in haste. Like a family was told, you're leaving in an hour, or you're leaving at night. You have a couple of hours to pack. So what do you take then? But I think the objects that I archived were quite a range. There were things as precious as jewelry and things as mundane as kitchen utensils. There were books and shawls and a very unusual crocodile head of a crocodile that someone had killed, which was precious to them. So very unusual objects like that also made it across the border. But I think it was very interesting to look at the story of belonging through the belongings that people carried.
What I find, particularly interesting, especially in Revenants, is the way you read the body language of the interviewees. Like this caressing that you were still telling me about, that they would caress something, they would be lost in thoughts, they would sigh, and there would be so much more that would be told through these body languages. And this is very true that, migration, forced migration, and all these things is so much about what was also left behind.
Right.
It's always about those things also that were left behind, and you keep thinking about them.
Yeah. But I
Now the
also
people.
feel like, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I want to say that when you are in these conversations, um, I find it's actually essential to pay attention to the gestures and sometimes even the silences of people, because not everything finds verbal language, right? Sometimes it is not a fully formed emotion that you can say to somebody, and so you it is done through gesture. Sometimes pain is shown through gesture, sometimes sadness is evoked in movement. And I think that these were things that I had to put into the text, so that we know that oral history is not only about what is said, but what is unsaid, or is gestured through the body.
And that is where I think your the next book, in the language of remembering, it very naturally progresses from that idea, because these people who had to undergo so much suffering, they found themselves unable to express themselves in a certain language, right? Because there's so much pain involved. And then there also a theory about, given by Len Scary, who talks about in the body in pain, where she says that, the body which is in pain, it is so difficult to describe itself, that, which place is aching or where is the pain lying. So your book also, in the language of remembering, is also based on finding this language to deal with the loss, the trauma in the succeeding generations as well. And while reading your book, I was also thinking that why it is important to talk and record the experiences of the second and third generations as well. Do you feel that the generation today still cares for what happened during partition? And how do the post memories of partition continue to affect them today?
I think this is exactly the question I had in my mind, because I always found myself saying that partition is not yet an event of the past. And I had never put time and research into actually seeing why that was. And so, in the language of remembering, is the culmination of that research to see whether people still care about partition, second, third, fourth generation. Um, I think that unless we engage with the topic of partition on a frequent enough basis in our households or otherwise, or maybe we've grown up with constant stories of it, we find ourselves quite unequipped to address the enormity of trauma that was caused by partition. And it seems that where in language there is space for nostalgia, other things remain mostly absent or disassociated until they are exhumed with delicacy over time. And it is not only the difficulty on the part of the survivor, someone who has seen that violence or trauma, in saying what has happened, but also the incapability of the descendant to demand that story or to demand that emotional sedimentation of partition. When I was doing my interviews with my grandparents, I struggled because I didn't know the questions to ask. I didn't know where my line of questioning should end. I didn't know my threshold yet. But you build language over time, and I think you build language in every interview that you do, because you are building a new language of trauma, intergenerational trauma, or intergenerational memory keeping, I would say, because not every story is traumatic. So, in the language of remembering, while I was doing the research, I wanted to understand how younger people, people who were my age, people who were younger than me, people who were my parents' age, were still thinking about partition. It is obviously an event that continues to impact the geopolitics of the subcontinent and continues to impact our relationship with our neighboring nations. But does it impact our thoughts, our fears, our perceptions of who the other is, the way we think about the past and the notion of belonging, or the aspect of origin, which for many people lies across the border? But naturally, there is a myriad of ways that people choose to remember and forget, and I wanted to create a cross border archive of that. Um, while when you are speaking with survivors, and I think this is the distinction I make, having spoken with survivors and now speaking with younger people, when you're speaking with survivors who have witnessed things firsthand, there is a definitive understanding that you are recording the past. But in this text of Descendants, where the past seems to have bled into the present, and everyone remembers partition in a visceral way. Not everyone talks about partition in their house. Some people don't know much about their families. Some people are struggling to find out more. Some people are not interested in knowing. And for some people, it impacts them as viscerally as their parents or grandparents. So, where the past seems to have bled into the present, and there are fault lines from history, either personal or political or geographic or ethnic or familial or religious, that have extended into the present day. It's very hard to substantiate the past being the past. Like in that sense, I feel like talking to descendants made me feel a lot more vulnerable, because there were people who were my age who were still connected or making connections to this historical event. And the sense of partition being quite prolonged, or we often call it the process of partition, that partition is a process. is not just a singular event that happened in a month or a day. That process felt almost alive, like I could feel it in every conversation. And I remember thinking, like, partition is somehow, I suppose, it has found a way to survive as some genealogical imprint. It has become like a feeling, an experience, a wound, a history, all at once. And I don't know whether we will ever not write about partition or think about partition, no matter how many generations pass, because every generation will find new ways to connect with the event.
Ms. Malhotra, you have crossed generations, you have crossed borders. This is a very personal question, which part has been your most favorite about this journey?
Um, that is actually, I think that there is something. It's a great privilege to listen to people's stories. I'm sure you understand perfectly well what I mean, because they're letting you into such a intimate, personal part of their history, which sometimes even their descendants don't know complete information about. And for someone to tell you their story, I think is an extraordinary privilege. And I think that is the part where I feel um, I I don't know. I like that the most. That someone is comfortable enough to share their story with me. But of course, with that sharing comes the sense of responsibility that you have to do justice to that story. So yeah.
Yeah, that is very much reflected in your story, each story that you cover, that you're so much connected with the person who is telling the story. I had an absolutely wonderful time talking to you today. Your books are so amazing and meaningful, and everybody who wishes to know more about partition should definitely be reading them.
Thank you
Thank
so
you for
much.
coming here today.
My
Uh,
pleasure.
for viewers, for viewers, the archive is continuing the dialogue around partition by doing this podcast series to stimulate your thinking and learning. We will be back tomorrow with more conversations. Don't forget to tune in at the same time. We'd like to receive your love and support. Thank you so much. And until we meet again, take care.